Good morning. How are we? Come on, I think you gotta do better than that. Thank you. We got one. We got one Energizer bunny in the room. Well, we're gonna make it more by the end of this, and I'm really excited for this panel because it's three of my favorite organizations and two of my favorite people and one of my new favorite people on stage together, talking about a really important subject, especially given the political context that we're living in today, which is how we really build a durable environmental, nature-based, conservation-based climate movement for the foreseeable future, one that doesn't just have to make progress when one side's in power, but really make progress when both sides are in power and not wait for the right political dynamic to make progress. And so I'd love for us to quickly go down the line and do a quick, brief intro. I know I said I wouldn't do that, but I think it'd be helpful just to give the context of your background, because you all come at this from slightly different perspectives, and all of our organizations have worked together in the past, and we just got off of a really successful initiative to fight a public land sell-off. And so I think, again, this is really great timing to have these organizations that were so instrumental in that be on the same stage together. So as a way of background, I'm Benji Backer. I'm the CEO of Nature is Nonpartisan, which is dedicated to building a nonpartisan environmental movement in America again. It used to be nonpartisan. I believe that it can be again. And these organizations also prove that it can be as well. So I'll actually start with Adam at the end and then go to Lisa and Georgie, and then we'll get into it.
So Outdoor Alliance serves as CEO, and we are a coalition of 9 national organizations, all oriented around a certain type of human-powered outdoor pursuit, like surfing and rock climbing, kayaking, backcountry skiing, and mountain biking. And what we do is we leverage the love and affection that all these organizations and their respective communities have for place and direct that to conserving and protecting these places for themselves and for the broader public.
Amazing.
I'm Lisa Ongenbrug. I am the Chief Program Officer at the National Park Foundation. We raise about $200 million a year to support national parks and support 400 organizations that work around the U.S. attached to individual parks, like the Grand Teton Foundation or the Friends of the Dunes at Indiana Dunes. We're very focused on both the visitor experience, but also educating youth, engaging youth, conserving land, standing up parks, and telling the American story.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Georgie Garrity. I am the Executive Director of the Nature Conservancy in Illinois and Midwest Partner. The best way to think about my job is we're really an outpost here in Chicago of a global conservation organization. The Nature Conservancy operates in 80 different countries around the world. We've been around for nearly 75 years. You're going to hear a theme here. We are nonpartisan and have a long history of collaboration, regardless of what party is in the White House. We are an organization that is committed to addressing loss of biodiversity and climate change. We are both boots on the ground in that we have preserves that we actively manage, but we also look at how to take actions related to biodiversity and climate change to scale. And thus we're involved in policy. So thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for that. And I think one of the things that you probably heard as a theme throughout all that is that all of us probably spend our free time outdoors, and then we also spend our lives dedicated to the outdoors. Adam, your job is pretty awesome representing the different recreational aspects of America. Lisa, I mean, you did the Outdoor Industry Association before this, and now NPF again. I think pretty much every American has a deep tie to the national parks. And then you literally missed our prep call because you were up in a national park last week. And so that's the sort of panel that you have up here. And I think that it really speaks to what the opportunity is to make progress, because it isn't a partisan challenge to care about the environment. We've made it one in America. There's lots of reasons for that. But almost every American has a deep connection to the environment like the four of us do up here. And so I really want to get into that. But before we do, I'd love to have each one of you go through what your most pressing policy and just general priorities are right now based on your own individual communities, because you each represent different communities, and I would imagine the National Park Foundation and Outdoor Alliance have similar end outcomes, but maybe different focuses right now. What are some of the main priorities right now and also the hurdles standing in the way? And I'm talking short term, like in the next 6 to 12 months. Where do you see things needing to head? And we'll start with you, Georgie.
Well, thank you. It's a great question, and there are a lot of pressing policy considerations, but I want to highlight three. We've been very focused on ensuring that public lands remain in public hands, and that with the upcoming budget process for FY26, that the agencies that we work most closely with that manage those lands, whether it's the Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, retain their funding. So I would say that's one priority. A second priority is we remain laser focused on climate change and clean energy. But the third one, and I think a lot of people will find this quite surprising, is the Farm Bill is a huge priority for the Nature Conservancy. If you think about it, in the lower 48, depending on how you calculate it, 50 to 60% of the land base, is working lands, either ranches, forest, or farmland. And the Farm Bill is really a critical vehicle. Believe it or not, it is the largest source of federal funding for land conservation, land restoration, and management. And there are many, many programs in the Farm Bill. Those of you who are familiar have heard acronyms like EQIP or CRP, but there are programs that enable private landowners to really improve the soil health on their properties, to set aside land for wildlife habitat protection. If they're in an area that's prone to flooding, setting aside land to allow it to function as a floodplain. And all of those benefits, are reaped by the public at large, even though they're undertaken by private landowners. As part of the reconciliation process, there was a period of time where it looked like many of those programs would be rolled back. They were not, but believe it or not, the demand for these programs far outstrips the available of funds. And so we as an organization are very focused on that. Now, you ask about the hurdles. I'd say pretty succinctly, time. Time is of the essence. These problems and challenges are only going to be more difficult to address if we wait. Coalition building, which I know is something close to your heart. But I would also say hope. I think sometimes people feel a bit overwhelmed that the problems like climate change or loss of biodiversity are so vast that there are not solutions, and there are, and the more that we can do to lift up those solutions and build momentum, the better off we'll all be.
Completely agree. Lisa?
So we're a little different. We're not an advocacy organization, but we do have one advocacy priority that I'll get to in just a second. But I want you to imagine the National Park Service as a whole. It's 85 million acres. 50% are specifically designated as wilderness, and 80% are managed as wilderness. So it's a vast network of possibilities, and I love the word hope, for America. And there are two things that are really immediate for us. One is the Great American Outdoors Act. The Legacy Restoration Fund expires in September. It's largely focused on infrastructure. So what's that got to do with this? There hasn't been a significant infrastructure investment in our national parks since the 1960s. So since the 1960s, we've been building a deferred maintenance backlog. And without the roads and campgrounds and maintenance facilities and all the things that make it possible for the Park Service to do its work, it's not possible to manage that vast wilderness acreage. So the infrastructure is really important. So that's our top legislative priority, is that the Great American Outdoors Act, which is now called the America Beautiful Act, gets reauthorized in September. The other thing to remember about the national parks is that 331 million people visited parks last year. That is more than attended in any NFL games, more than bought tickets for the Eras Tour for Taylor Swift, and more than that went to Disneyland. So it is beloved by the American public. People want to go there, and they want to see this uniquely American park system. Wallace Stegner called it America's best idea, and it definitely is. It is something that we should be proud of as our heritage, proud of as the legacy that we have in this country, and the legacy we're going to provide to our children in the future. So the other thing we're focused on is, I'm sure you're not thinking about this, but next year begins the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And what has that got to do with the Park Service? Well, we believe that the parks represent the best of what is American, our history, our culture, our legacy, and it will really be an opportunity to highlight and focus on what public lands, and in particular, what national parks bring to us as a country. And so we're hoping it's not really a policy priority as much as it's going to be something we're going to be very focused on, a rallying cry, and engaging our 400 partners across the United States in getting people to see just how critical these public lands are to your daily lives.
Amazing. Adam?
Concur with what Georgie and Lisa had to say for sure. Keeping public lands public, hard to overstate how profoundly important that is for our community. Second, making sure the agencies that oversee our public lands, like the Park Service, but also the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and others, have the resources they need in terms of financial resources, and also the staffing and infrastructure to pursue their missions and take care of these places, for their intrinsic value and the value they provide to everybody that lives in this country. All right. If they don't have the resources to do their jobs, it's kind of a fool's errand, and you have to have both. So public lands and the agencies in an intact way to pursue their missions. And then the third thing, I know you said kind of a shorter timeline, but I think you got to start early on some big ideas, and that is we're trying to cultivate a more generous way of thinking about conservation. And what I mean by that is that historically conservation was protect, throttle development, because we kind of went bananas with development for like a really long time in this country. And over the last 60 or so years, there's this effort to hey, slow things down, be cool, don't develop, protect. And that's profoundly important, but it's incomplete, especially with climate. So how do we define conservation in a way that you protect places, but also you build things, you manage for wildfire, you think about making sure our landscapes are more resilient, right? You can leverage the value that they've got for climate in terms of not just biodiversity, but carbon sequestration. And if you've got the courage, think about renewable energy. We're protecting all these places, but if you jack up emissions and it's at the expense of these places, what are you really doing? So having the big picture thinking to think, okay, how do we develop renewable energy? How do we think about transmission lines? How do we create some built environments that are thoughtful and careful and coexist with the landscape in a more elegant way? That kind of stuff should count for conservation just as much as wilderness, wild and scenic rivers, and all the things that we're comfortable with. And the challenge to all this stuff, it's there's a political challenge. I think it's more of a social, emotional challenge, identity challenge, to kind of reframe what success looks like. And in terms of keeping public lands public, we'll get into this later, but there's a lot of forces out there that would like to not have that be the case. We just found that out with the Senate and House reconciliation bills. And in terms of funding for these agencies, there's a bit of a tug of war going on. The administration put out a pretty meager, bare bones budget proposal, but thankfully Congress has responded in a more generous way, and we'll see how that shakes out.
Really good points there. And I think I would love to just briefly touch on, Lisa, what you and I just experienced a few weeks ago, and TNC was there as well. We had about 25 CEOs and executives from some of the top environmental organizations in the country, but not just traditional NGOs in the environmental space. We also had the hunting and fishing groups and a lot of outdoor rec groups. And we're working on, and Adam, you and I were on the phone during a lot of that, and we're working on that together too. We're going to have a roadmap that we're going to release and really help craft the future of this narrative in partnership with a lot of these groups, because there's actually a lot of, as you can tell, a lot of similar priorities amongst these organizations. And the reality is, I think we're all probably sick and tired, even though it's only been 8 months of it, but sick and tired of just being against things that we don't like. And what can we be for together that actually moves the needle forward? Instead of just avoiding disaster and avoiding the worst case scenario, how can we build a durable pathway forward? And that's something that each one of us is working on. And I think it's really important to touch on 2 points that you guys made. One is the hope aspect. If everyone just thinks that there's no chance to make progress, then no one leans in. And I'm seeing a massive civic downturn in the U.S. that's really alarming, because it allows the loudest, most divisive voices to be prevalent. But the people in this room and the people that your organizations work with, we need normal Americans to speak up on this stuff. We're really having a crisis in America with activism and activists, because we only have the far left and the far right now, and everyone else is just hopeless, and they're shutting down, and I think we all need to step up. And then the other thing is, you mentioned, Lisa, the increase in visitation to these places. We have a degradation of our environment happening at the same time that more people are visiting it than ever before. And so we not only would have that infrastructure crisis without climate change, but then that's exacerbating it. So going on that, we just had an ability to avoid a really bad policy from happening, which would have been a 3 million acre sell-off of our public lands. Each one of our organizations played a really critical role in that. And that was against something bad, right? What issues do you feel like we can actually push forward together on? And the more specific, honestly, the better for this, because there were a lot of unlikely allies that showed up to stave off the public lands fight. You had you had far-right militia people, and you had far-left people and center-right people and center-left people all fighting against Mike Lee's public land sell-off. How can we use that momentum for things that are good, and what does that look like in your eyes? And Adam, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, I think momentum, but also insights and wisdom, right? Like, why did people respond with such vigor and force? Why was the effort successful, right? And I think that, we're still processing. It wasn't that long ago, but it was a pretty simple proposition: keep public lands or sell them off. But also it related to people's identity, how they think of themselves and their relationships to place and to each other. And that was threatened. And when people's sense of identity is threatened or called into question, it motivates people to take action in a way that's different than if you're just talking about things in an intellectual way or a policy way. Not that those things don't matter, but if you're able to frame things in terms of people, how they see themselves, it catalyzes a whole level, different level of action.
Really good point. And on the rec side, are there any policy areas that you think we could build consensus on that you're seeing, like, whether this fiscal year from a congressional perspective or at the state level?
For sure. Well, the Farm Bill, it's funny because it's like, you think it's about farming, right? Yes, but so much more. It's an avenue for tremendous conservation work, and it keeps getting passed. Every time it's in cycle, Congress gets together, they figure it out. So I'm hopeful for that. And as Lisa mentioned, the Legacy Restoration Fund in terms of deferred maintenance, we passed it last time 5 years ago under the first Trump administration. Like, why not do it again? So I'm hopeful. And then last year, we passed the Explore Act, which is this huge piece of recreation and conservation legislation, bipartisan. So I'm hopeful as well,
Those are great pieces. Lisa?
I have to take off my National Park Foundation hat just for a second, because I think the thing is, building off what Adam said, it's hope, and people protect what they love. So it relates to national parks because people love national parks, and it makes them care about the outdoors if they have this great experience at the national parks. But we also have to remember a really key player besides private landowners are the states. And I used to run a state-based foundation, and public lands measures at the state level pass 9 out of 10. They pass with 60 and 70% approval ratings. And they're often for things that provide multiple benefits. So I think there's a story here for those local initiatives and this other public lands work is people protect what they love. And so they have to experience it, know it, and have some relation to it for them to be willing to take action and stand up for it. And I think those local ballot initiatives are a great example of that. And I think what worked in this last campaign that Adam described also is, I think it was your organization that did this, somebody did a great job of being able to show pictures and stories of the actual places, and people could really relate to that.
Yeah, that was us.
That was amazing,
Yeah.
by the way. I mean, that just allowed a lot of people to step in and say, hands off my personal public land, right? Like the one that I recreate in, the one that I love, rather than just like someplace thousands of miles away, which, if you ask somebody if they care about the polar bears or they care about Grand Tetons or something, they'll say yes, but it's not, they don't care about it as much as whatever they, experience on a day-to-day basis. So you guys did a great job of that. Georgie?
So I want to echo a theme of, people want to protect what they love, and that I think that includes a way of life. And what comes to my mind is natural infrastructure. Bear with me, like what do I mean by natural infrastructure? I think what Lisa talked about is key. We all know we have a problem with infrastructure in this country. I think, what was it, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave our national infrastructure a C-, that's that gray. Infrastructure, that's dams, that's levees, that's those are seawalls, those are highways and bridges. But natural infrastructure can be very complementary to that. And that is that when you have a coastal area, for example, that's experiencing damage from storms and hurricanes by augmenting the dunes or restoring the coral reefs, or by planting mangroves, you can really mitigate through natural systems in a way that really complements the gray infrastructure. So I want to circle back, though, to how can people rally around it. I mean, I think we all know the horrific flooding that has happened in Texas, the extraordinary loss of life, but unfortunately, that is something that has been replicated again and again and again across the United States. I mean, here in the Midwest, we have a lot of fresh water. If you look at the map, the entire western boundary of Illinois is the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River floods a lot. It is heavily leveed, as is the Missouri River. And those of you in the Midwest who live in this area will certainly recall, those of you who don't, in 2019 there were devastating floods along the Missouri River. I mean, when I say devastating, I mean in a single county, Atchison County, which is in the far north west of Missouri, very conservative area, I would say. They had 100 levees overtopped. Over 1 million acres of farmland was underwater. And when that drained, 56,000 acres remained completely underwater, with devastating economic consequences to the local community, going back to the way of life. And what happened was federal partners like the Army Corps worked with the local levee district, and they felt they had no choice but to move the levees back, a levee setback. And that sounds really simple. But if you think about what that entails, it's a huge infrastructure project. And if done well, there's a complement of the natural infrastructure, because when you move a levee back, essentially you're giving a river room to breathe. And when you give a river room to breathe, you create a natural floodplain that provides recreational opportunities, lots of them, whether it's kayaking or fishing or hunting. Those natural wetlands act as a filter. Because think about it, when you have devastating floods, it's carrying all sorts of toxins, and they carry downriver, and those new wetlands act as a filter. And I really liked what Lisa shared about and the importance of state, that we, the Nature Conservancy, ended up working with the local drainage district, the Army Corps, the state, and a lot of other partners, including all the farmers, to set back this levee, to add in the natural infrastructure, which all goes back to your point. it was a community engagement. I mean, it was an all-in effort to save a local community. And I think those kinds of projects are what provide their concrete solutions. They give people hope, and they provide a path forward.
100%. I was just on stage with a social justice leader in Seattle last week, and he was talking about how when Flint, Michigan, and a couple of Midwestern disasters have happened over the last few years, he's gone there, and his joke on stage was he's never been hugged by so many white people in his life, and in MAGA hats. And I think that one of the unique things about nature is that, especially in terms of a disaster or preparing for a disaster, you can build a lot of unlikely allyships because people want to protect their communities. They want to have healthy communities. They want to have safe communities, and they also want to have clean air and clean water. And so having those people respond, the states and local communities build a mechanism for success for the future, not just responding to this disaster, is something that we can build on. A lot of times it's harder to build towards solutions rather than responding to disasters, because people oftentimes let perfect be the enemy of the good, right? They're like, okay, well, I don't like where the funding comes from for this policy, or I don't like the way that permitting reform has to deal with oil and gas and renewables, so I'm not going to let this pass. And then it ends up hurting renewables, or it ends up killing the funding mechanism for the public lands in the first place. And so how do we all have slightly different levels of engagement on these topics, but we all probably have slightly different ways of getting there. And if we're talking about politics, it's oftentimes the different ways of getting there hold us up from getting there at all. So how do we, as a community, stop letting, how do we stop avoiding perfect being the enemy of the good and actually make progress? And we'll start with you, Georgie.
Oh, fantastic question. I would say that any durable solution is going to involve compromises, because I mean, it's inherent, I think, in any longstanding policy endeavor, and we have to be able to embrace the fact that you're making progress toward an outcome. It may not be the ultimate outcome, but as long as you are moving toward that outcome, I mean, you have to embrace that as being on a journey. One thing, though, that I have think a lot about is that when we build coalitions, we're all part of a conservation and environmental coalition. But if you think about a challenge or a problem, more like a Venn diagram, that we have, a certain set of values and goals that we're working toward, and there may be other organizations that have different values, but yet we're working toward the same goal. And I'm going to stick with rivers, and I'm going to give you a great example. Stick with the Mississippi River. Ag is a cornerstone of the economy in Illinois. We're part of the breadbasket of the world, and a lot of the corn and soy that is harvested in Indiana and in Illinois and in Iowa travels along the Illinois River and down the Mississippi by barge. And if you are a farmer, you harvest your crops, you put them in silos, and you watch the market. You watch the commodities market, and when the price is right, you sell your product, and it has to be put on a barge. But yet, if you have flooding events, the barges can't run. And so who is very concerned about water levels in the Mississippi River? Who's concerned about the impact of climate change and how that is affecting the navigation of the Illinois River? I mean, it's the barge operators, and it's the farmers, and the end goal is a navigable river, a healthy river. We want that too. But obviously, we're coming from a different point. I think we need to really look for those center points in the Venn diagram, because you can really come up with some very surprising and beneficial coalitions in that way.
Totally. I mean, the word you said at the beginning, compromise, is deemed a dirty word these days, and I think that it gets to the heart of the question, and I think you just showed that people don't have to compromise necessarily if they share the same end goal, but you might have to compromise on some of the policies. I mean, the National Park Foundation, you guys have seen decades of progress for the national parks, or centuries, or a century and a half of progress for the national parks, and I'm sure there were disagreements, along the way of how to get there. How do you see compromise actually happening so that we don't get caught up in the details so much so that we don't get to the solutions that we need?
I think, we're largely addressing policy, but there are probably some funders in the room. So I want to think about funders because we're a funder as well. And so I think there's always a belief that there's going to be a magic national policy solution, that if you fund this one thing, it's all going to get fixed. And the reality is we need to pass policies and funding that allow for flexibility at the local level so that we can try some pilots and innovate. We talk a lot about innovation. There's a lot of talk about innovation at this conference. There's a lot of talk about innovation when it comes to infrastructure. But I think we have to be innovative and willing to try a few things. What's going to work in Illinois might not work in Kansas, which might not work in Florida, which might not work in California. And I think about our major conservation successes, things that have happened recently. The Everglades is a great example, which is a national park. It was local people really driving that and really looking at both water quality, water quantity, invasive species, state policy, federal policy, local policy. We see that time and time again in the success stories we've seen. A really great one is in Yosemite, the Ackerson Meadow project. We were able to restore the largest wetland complex of its type in California in Ackerson Meadows, but it had to be a variety of things happening in a variety of ways. There needed to be a land donation. There needed to be several organizations working together locally on the ground to get that to happen. Several organizations and corporations working together to do the restoration project. Several organizations and corporations working with indigenous youth. And I think that's another piece of this that we really should be talking about, and it's a big push for us, is tribal co-stewardship and recognizing what that can bring to the table, particularly locally. Work that we're doing with the Wabanaki youth, work that we did at Yosemite, things that are happening in the Everglades. And there's just a lot to learn here. But again, the big learning for me there also is it's not a monolithic knowledge across the United States, and it really is attached to a place and to local organizations. So we need to be thinking about federal land, federal policy, national land, national policy, and funding, but with the ability to support local, community-driven ideas. I think that's where common ground starts and can then bloom from there.
Completely agree. Adam?
So perfect, the enemy of the good. I don't know if it's an enemy, but it's I think perfection's a delusion. It's like kind of a siphon for time and energy. You need to start off with what you want, what your community wants. It's important, but you got to spend time understanding what other people, other stakeholders want, and bringing some empathy and some compassion, and more fundamentally, like curiosity. Just really, like, what makes that person, that community, that stakeholder tick? What's motivating them and why? You don't have to agree with them, but if you don't understand how they're looking at the world, finding consensus and finding that Venn diagram is like exceedingly difficult. And you get locked into what you want, and you think that you're right, and everything's on your side. It might feel like, you're on a mission, everything's cool, but you're just going around in circles. And, it reminds me a bit of how I got started in conservation. It wasn't really intentional. So I live in Washington, D.C., which, here's like a secret. It's the best whitewater city in the world. It's like the best whitewater kayaking city. You're all thinking of me like you're a loon. It's true, okay? Just outside the Beltway, the Potomac, the bottom falls out of the Potomac, and we got a basically unlimited amount of water. Yes, who said Great Falls? Right on, yes. So I moved there. I got pretty into the whitewater scene in DC, and I'm still a big part of it. And I was practicing law, and some guy comes up to me in the parking lot and said, "Hey, Kramer," because you call everybody by your last name when you're a kayaker because you're like stuck emotionally in the 8th grade. He's like, "You're a lawyer, right?" I was like, yeah, and I'm waiting for like, can you help my brother-in-law? And I'm like, I don't do that kind of stuff. And he's like, we need some help renegotiating the hydropower permit on the upper Youghiogheny River in western Maryland, okay? It's Maryland's first wild and scenic river. It's an amazing whitewater resource. I said, yeah, I'll do it. I didn't know anything about hydropower or negotiating anything with like big multinational companies, but I did it because it was important to me, and I knew the place, I knew the community, it was important to my friends. I'm like, all right, give it a try. So we're in these negotiations, and it's complicated because you got the power company, they want to generate power. You have the people living around the reservoir, they want the lake at a certain level. It's a blue ribbon trout stream, so you need to keep the temperature at a certain level so the fish can thrive and you have a resilient ecosystem. And you got boaters like us that want whitewater releases. And we're going back and forth and coming up with the flow regime, like when they release the water. And we get like caught up on May. And the guy who's representing the angling community, this guy Jim Gracie, he's like, you can't have these releases in May in the afternoon. And we're going around and I'm like, Jim, like, the water's in the, what do you care? Don't you guys get up at the crack of dawn to go fish? And he looks at me, he's like, it's the flies. I'm like, what? He's like, the flies, that's when the flies are out. I'm like, oh, so like that's the best time to fish all year in May? Because the flies are doing their thing and getting the fit. And he's like, yeah, idiot. And so I was like, take it. I can relate, I understand. Peak conditions, you could have it. And then the hydropower people were like, well, could we like adjust the flow like a little bit? I was like, well, why? He's like, well, if you could adjust, you could modulate how much water or how much energy you put into the grid, we can make a ton of money. And most hydropower facilities aren't able to do that. So we're like, we've got a right to the amount of water, but they can make a lot of money. We're like, all right, like, let's experiment. Let's see. We could adjust like a little bit. So we ended up getting a really good permit. So like, it's good for the fish, good for the boaters, good for everybody. But if we all just locked in with our respective positions, we still are around that table. And if you don't bring things like curiosity, compassion, and like a desire to like help people get things a little bit better, it's hard. But when you do find that consensus, like that's what perfection is. It's not what you think. It's like collectively getting something that's better because of it. So.
Right, and that provides durability too, because when you do that, other stakeholders are bought in. They're not going to undo it, when they have the chance to undo it, which they will. Yeah, and I think we're seeing that play out right now. I think back to the statistic I've seen of 80% of Americans self-identifying as environmentalists in 1990. Today it's 38%. And so those people didn't just stop caring about the environment. This issue's become a culture war issue. People have dug into their own corners. And if we just write that whole percentage of people off as not caring about the environment instead of learning about what they need from a policy, then we won't get to what we need. And so my final question before we go to Q&A is, the thing that we're hanging on by a thread in the United States right now is that connection to nature is a unifying theme. We are hanging on by a thread because, as I just said, the statistics aren't looking good in terms of people seeing this as a polarizing issue. But the public land sell-off was a great example that underbelly is still there for America. How can we capitalize on the reality of this being a nonpartisan or just American issue, a unifying issue in this really tough political moment? Working across ideologies right now is not very popular. You get primaried for it or whatever. But how can we do that on this issue in this tough moment, and what opportunities do you see ahead? Georgie?
Well, I think the storyline is a lot more positive than the news might indicate, and I don't say that trying to be a Pollyanna. One of the things that we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about is biodiversity in cities, and whether it's tree planting or efforts to mitigate stormwater or to enhance biodiversity. There are lots of examples not just in Chicago, but across the country. And I think in this highly polarized environment, the good news stories don't always make the top of the headlines. And I think that really how to capitalize that is what we're doing today, to talk about it. I mean, our chief scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, says the best thing that people can do with respect to climate change is just talk about it. We don't have these conversations enough where you discuss, gosh, you know, I used to skate, you know, starting in December here, the pond doesn't freeze anymore. And that is where you get to those kind of that point of curiosity. And so I think we need to be more mindful about discussing what we're seeing, but also lifting up these stories because they are there. They are there. And then I think that there's this, it's human nature. Success breeds success. People like to be part of something. You want to be part of something, especially if it's something that you feel will be successful. And it's like, how do we generate this momentum and to feel like you're something bigger than yourself, and that's something that will have kind of impact for future generations. So, I mean, it sounds, you know, pretty simple, but I just think having these conversations, whether it's at your family dinner table or, you know, dare I say, sitting next to someone on an airplane, you know, having these conversations, because the moment is there. And I think one thing I just want to leave you with on this question is kind of related to something Lisa said just about the power of local initiatives. For those of you that flew into Chicago and did not have a window seat, make sure you get one on the way back. Because if you look out that window, you're going to see a huge swath of green. We have Lake Michigan, City of Chicago, and a huge swath of green. And that is the Cook County Forest Preserve District. It's huge. It has been in place for decades. And it's a great source of recreation, provides a lot of biodiversity benefits. In November 2024, the residents of Cook County overwhelmingly voted for a tax increase, a huge tax increase that covered not only land acquisition, but management, improved management and infrastructure improvements, because people care. And the whole effort around that referendum generated conversation and has generated momentum, and that momentum led to 4 of the collar counties pursuing similar referendums. And now the hope is that will continue downstate. So that's like a example of how telling the story, building on that base, generates momentum that leads to change.
Completely agree. And I mean, Louisiana, a very red state, just did the same thing. They have all this offshore energy development, and they overwhelmingly voted to put all that money towards public lands and conservation efforts. And that was, I think, 80-20 it passed in a red state. So it's telling those stories because success does breed success. If you can do that there, you can replicate that same policy elsewhere, or you can do even bigger things. Lisa?
I don't have too much to add because we've been talking about it. I do think the really focusing on why local ballot initiatives are passing with such high percentages should be a story for us. Because, you know, what is the magic formula? And the things that we know about that are people care about the place. Often it's multiple benefits for multiple people. And there's a champion, and they make it really about your daily life. The Everglades are an example of that. You know, the one here for me that's very close, and I'm not even sure most of you have been there, but Indiana Dunes is your national park that's very close. And a group of local citizens got that created first as a national lakeshore, then a national park. It's within a short hour's drive of one of the largest school districts in the nation here in Chicago, and that's really important because I think that's the other piece of this, and that's the long game in my mind. I realized early on, I started out as a wildlife biologist and then was a just pure conservationist. But about 15 years ago, Richard Louve's book came out, Last Child in the Woods, and I got really interested in, from a policy standpoint, everything we're talking about is a construct of a legal construct that will only exist if people continue to want that legal construct and believe in that legal construct and advocate for it. And I think if we don't, at the same time that we're thinking about the short-term game, which is people protect what they love, we have to think about the long game, which is who are the future people that are going to protect what they love? And what's changed? Why has there been a disconnect? How do we change that disconnect? I think we've got this real opportunity. I think of national parks as our largest classroom, and I think about a place like Indiana Dunes. It's 15,000 acres. It's one of the most biologically diverse parks in the entire system. You know, people think about Yellowstone and Grand Canyon and Acadia, but Indiana Dunes has amazing birding and an incredible diversity of wildlife species and is so close to this major urban area. What an opportunity.
Adam?
Be civically engaged, right? When you talk about how 80% of people identified as environmentalists, now it's down to 30%, but the sentiment is consistent. People still feel this way. Now, lawmakers, they listen to their constituents. It's true, right? So voting is important, but like letting them know what you think about something, showing up at a town hall meeting, letters to the editor, being present, taking that sentiment that we all have about why protecting these places is so important and letting lawmakers know we're making these decisions it's difficult to overstate how important that is. And they take constituents very, very seriously. Well, they're constituents. If you work for somebody that doesn't represent you, they're like, whatever. But for the people that represent you, they will listen. And it's also like, you know, Congress is big and there's like 535 people that are elected. And we got to focus on 3. Your congressperson, your 2 senators on the federal stuff, or, you know, governor or county, but whoever is accountable to you, they genuinely are accountable to you. And they want to hear what you have to say. And, you know, that's something over which we all have some control and agency.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if people in America stood up like that we did for the public land sell-off for other issues as well. I mean, that is what stopped it. It wasn't money in politics that stopped it. It wasn't, you know, partisan politics that stopped it. It was literally just everyone in America standing together. The civic engagement actually worked, and I think a lot of people are skeptical that it works. It just worked a few weeks ago, and it was the sole reason. There was not a single other reason why that worked. We'll open it up for Q&A for now if anybody has a question. Yes.
Has become politically charged, just that term itself. Climate change does not appeal to everyone, but again, to what you were saying, you know, people want to be able to go to their parks, they want to be able to farm, they want to be able to, you know, kayak on that river. So coming at it, I think the language that we use is really important as far as bringing folks from across the various spectrum together. But anyway, thank you all for your comments. It was really, really great conversation.
So I think to solve some of these challenging issues, we need truth, we need compromise, and we need compassion or curiosity. What do you think are the enabling conditions or the opportunities to make that happen? I mean, you said local, but, you know, we're rewarded on social media and communication for fighting, not for getting along. So maybe you could talk about ways that we can take those things and make them happen at a scale that is demanded to take on these big challenges.
Anyone want to take that? That's a really good question.
It's really interesting what you said, Chad, about people focus on the negative on social media, and I think that's changing, and I think stories of hope are really starting to become viral and resonate. You know, just from personal experience, when I post about, you know, and I think it's true for many organizations, people want to be for something. They want to hear about hope. They want to have stories of good, and we've got to figure out a way to share them at scale. Maybe I'm just being too hopeful. I just think we've had a lot of negativity, and people are hungry for stories of hope and accomplishment, and it can be a small story about something good that happened in the environment. It can be a story about a child. I just think there's a real appetite for it. I could be wrong, but I do see the tide shifting a little bit.
Building on that theme of hope, maybe I could ask the panelists, and this would include Benji, do you see potential for young people to be productively engaged in future-proofing our natural legacy? And is there something different we need to do than we've been doing to engage young people?
Yeah, I'll start. So first of all, I think it's fair to say the reason that Aspen Climate is happening in Chicago is because of young people. I mean, full stop there. Yeah. Yes. So and I will say that I think that there has to be a deliberate effort to create a space for young people at the table. And I think that, there are, these biases. You need to have experience. You need to have earned it. You need to, you need to wait. But what is happening now with respect to, biodiversity and climate change, I mean, speaking for myself, I mean, although the impacts are clear, the really devastating impacts, I'm not going to be around to see. It's the next generation, but there are people on this earth who are, and I do think that creating in a very deliberate way, space, and it's not just for advocacy. It's also for ideas and perspective, and it has to be. There also has to be a willingness to listen. You can create space and listen, but then not take action. And I think it's a mind shift. And I'm speaking just for our own organization. I think we are being much more deliberate about engaging young people. It's a responsibility and obligation.
I think you ought to answer that question,
Yeah.
Benji. One of the reasons I'm such a Benji fan is that he is so much younger than I am and is relatively new to the movement. And so I would really like to hear from you.
Well, I really appreciate that, and Dan, thanks for the question. I'm a byproduct of people believing in young people, so I just want to be transparent about that. I wouldn't be up here if people didn't believe in me because I was young. And I do think that there is, in our movement, a pretty good recognition of that. But it's largely at the individual scale, and we need it at the mass scale. So people who believed in me as an individual, or I'm sure there are a certain group of individuals who help make this event happen. But how do we do it at mass scale? And I actually want to go back to your conversation about bringing Chicago students to the dunes. I do think as a climate movement, we've focused too much on climate education and not enough about nature and conservation education. Get people out in the community, out in nature, so they can actually learn how to connect with it. Because that's why I care, right? And that's why all of us on stage care. But if you've never had that opportunity and you hear that the world's burning, you're just going to shut down because you don't even have a personal passion to it, and the world's burning. I mean, how bad is that? So, I mean, I grew up in an educational system where if we didn't actually get out to the outdoors. We only learned about climate change and how bad it was. And it really just drained everybody in that room. And then I don't see any of those people active in this community whatsoever. So I'm really glad that young people made this happen. I think young people are the future of this. I think they're already the part of why something like this can even be pulled off. But that is still a small percentage of people. Most young people are resigned to the fact that this issue is not solvable, and they're just kind of going on their daily lives, and they're kind of forgetting that it exists whatsoever. So I think if we can tie people's personal connection to the environment once again, get people off their phones and off social media. A young person looking at Instagram might be one of the most depressing things in the entire world because people only share the horrible things that are going on in the world. And then you're addicted to this screen of negativity. So if you can be addicted to the outdoors, that's a lot better of a thing. I literally got here late at 2 a.m. last night because I was hiking yesterday and I wanted to take a later flight to get here. I think that's what everybody in this country yearns for, is more time outdoors, and especially the next generation. But if they don't have that opportunity, they won't be able to fight for it in the way that we need them to. So that's how I think we get the next generation involved. Last question.
I'd be really interested to hear your perspectives on whether biotechnology has a role to play in hope in a space where there might be bipartisan interest and solutions for climate adaptation and mitigation. So drought-resistant crops have been in the world for a long time. Trees that grow faster are being planted in degraded lands. Like, what are thoughts about biotechnology as a source of hope and bipartisanship?
Anybody want to take that?
I'm down.
Adam.
No, I agree. Like, why not? Like,
Right.
yes.
We got a yes. All right, there we go. Easy. I think you jump in.
So
I think we might have time for one more.
Yeah, well, I'll say yes with a caveat. So we have to be open-minded and receptive to all sorts of solutions, but technology is not going to solve these problems alone. And I think there's sometimes a tendency to think that there'll be a technological solution. We just need to wait. And when it becomes an excuse for delay, that's where it becomes very problematic.
Yeah, it's not an answer all in and of itself, but like the thoughtful application of technology and design, like why wouldn't you use that? Like, but again, like to Georgie's point, that's a means to an end. It's not an end.
I think it's a
in
yes
itself.
and if you think about the next generation question that Dan posed, it's also a great way for young people to feel like they can help create the solution if they want to do it in a technological way rather than just a community-based way or a political way. It's just another avenue. You could start a company, you could join a business trying to solve these problems, but I think that it's a yes and it's not the only solution. Maybe one more? Yeah, go ahead. In the white shirt, you got it.
So around the world, there's a really exciting kind of nascent movement for the rights of nature. In Ecuador, New Zealand, and certain municipalities in the US and the UK, what potential do you see for the rights of nature being enshrined in American law and imagination in the years to come?
Anybody? Adam? Yes, again?
I mean, I think we got other fish to fry. I think I'd like to see law address other things, other inequities that are far more severe for people. We got a long way to go. We made some progress, not there yet. That's my personal take.
Well, there's a famous essay. I think it was written maybe 30 years ago. Do trees have rights in the United States? And my response to that is I think that I'm not sure it's helpful when especially when we're thinking about durability of solutions, to separate nature from people. I mean, there can be inherent values of biodiversity, and there are, but we have to think about the human impact. And when you try to separate those, I think that really fuels, in many ways, some of the divides. And I think that really identifying that connection between nature and people, that symbiotic connection, is really the best path forward to those durable solutions.
I think it's really important to note that the rights of nature litigation around the world.
Her point was that the rights for nature is a doorway to what we were talking about on this panel. We are closing today with just, I think, a lot of optimism. I can hear it on the panel. The one thing that I thought I wanted to add that maybe wasn't brought up is also just the importance of the right validators at the right time. We learned that in the public lands fight. We had the hunting community speaking to the hunting community. We had the fishing community speaking to the fishing community. I'm critiqued a lot for working with the Trump administration, but I'm willing to work with anybody to get things done, whether I voted for them or not. And we put something in his language, and he embraced it. We made a conservation agenda that he just signed an EO on 2 weeks ago, and we framed it in his words. And he embraced it, because right now we need people to communicate messages in the way that they want to be communicated to. And you won't be able to do that if you don't understand those communities at all. And so I think if we can do a better job of figuring out where this Venn diagram is, figuring out where the overlap is on policy, figuring out, I loved your perfection is a delusion, but the real perfection is a combination of everyone's priorities. I loved that. Because that is durability. And so what I leave you with is hopefully some optimism, but hopefully something that you can take home to your communities and fight for together, because this issue is so much bigger than politics. This issue is so much bigger than hating Trump or loving Trump. This is about the future of nature, and whether it's the rights for nature or whether it's the national parks or whatever we need to support, this is the one thing that we can find common ground on. So thank you for finding that common ground on stage today. Thank you for listening, and have a great rest of the conference. Thank you so much.